When studying minerals, it's helpful to compare them to vitamins. Take deficiencies. With vitamins, most vitamins, and there's a fairly swift and specific deficiency that develops. Whereas minerals, the deficiency can take years to develop, and the negative impactors are influenced by many other factors. Compare vitamin C and calcium. A deficiency of vitamin C leads to scurvy, and it can develop in a matter of weeks or months. Recovery from scurvy can start in as little as 1 or 2 days when you take vitamin C supplements, so it's very specific to vitamin C. Now, inadequate calcium leads to reduced bone mass and an increased risk for osteoporosis. These can take years to develop, and there are many other factors that determine whether you actually will develop them. Given this longer time frame and this less specificity, researching minerals like calcium is harder, and yet it's easier to ignore them because of that inadequate intake. We don't see it so quickly, but it doesn't mean it's any less important. Now, to understand calcium, we need to understand bone. So we're going to review bone as we go through this. Now, if you look at bone, it looks like it's an inert substance, yet it's very dynamic. Tissue is constantly being built, broken down, and rebuilt. There are 2 types of cells that are responsible for this process. They're the osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Very similar words, but the one letter difference. You can usually remember them because if you think about the B in the osteoblast, it means to build, and these are the types of cells that will build bone tissues. The C, usually you can think about the word chew because the osteoclast will break down tissue. Now, this bone remodeling is not only important to maintain healthy bone, it's also important because those osteoclasts can liberate calcium from the bone and allow it to be reabsorbed back into the blood. Long term, that may not be good for the bone, but it's really vital in maintaining blood calcium levels. Over a lifetime, there'll be 3 phases in these 2 bones and how they relate to each other. The first phase phase 1 is where the osteoblasts are more productive than the osteoclasts, so we have them working more. And what is happening with phase 1 is they're going to be bone growth, and to the point that we have peak bone mass. So phase 1 until you get to that point. Typically for females, that will be until about age 20, and for males a little bit older, maybe the mid-20s. So phase 1, we're building bone. Phase 2 is there is an equilibrium between the osteoblast and the osteoclast, and we will have stable bone mass. Finally, we get to phase 3. This is where the osteoblasts are less productive than the osteoclasts. And actually with this phase, we have both less osteoblasts and more osteoclasts. Bad all the way around. So phase 3, we are going to have bone loss. It typically starts around the age 40, but in particular for women, we're going to have accelerated rates of bone loss around the menopause, so 5 to 7 years around menopause. If we have enough bone loss, we will get to that point where there is this risk for bone fracture, and we have the condition called osteoporosis. Osteoporosis, if we look at that word, osis just means condition, porous means holes in our bones. So we've got holes in our bones. Let's look at that a little bit more specifically. If we look at bones, look at this image. We've got 2 types of bone, major types, trabecular and cortical. Trabecular is very lacy, metabolically active, a lot of surface area, and the cortical bone is usually the outside of bones. It's very strong and much less metabolically active. Trabecular bones are going to be the ones that are vulnerable to osteoporosis. Here is a cross-section of healthy trabecular bone. It's very lacy, but the structure is very intact and strong. And down here we have much bone loss. So this would be a bone with osteoporosis. You can just see the holes that are in there. This bone is going to be vulnerable to two things. One, it's going to be much more likely to break, and it also is vulnerable to compression. So those places where we have more trabecular bone are going to be at risk for those problems. And we'll find trabecular bone at the ends of bones. So think about at that hip, and this is where that hip bone is going into the femur going into the hip, and our wrists, and also in our vertebrae. So that's where we're going to have problems with osteoporosis. This image here is of three women, and we can just see what's happening here. Here's the daughter. She has a straight back with her vertebrae being straight and strong, but as they get older, this is the mother, and here's the grandmother. Their vertebrae, which are rich in trabecular bone, are compressing and very likely could be breaking in response to this loss of trabecular bone. Compare that to their height from their hips down. Almost no loss there, very similar between these generations. And that's because there's much more of that cortical bone, so it's much stronger and less vulnerable to that osteoporosis. Now, people think about low calcium intake and the development of osteoporosis. But remember, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the only risk factor. Some of the risk factors we can't control. Those would include gender. Females are more at risk. Females have a lower peak bone mass, so they're going to actually get to that vulnerable stage of fracture zone and osteoporosis sooner than do men. Another one is age. Both men and women, as we get older, we're losing that bone mass. And then individuals of Asian and Caucasian race have a higher risk for osteoporosis. All of those we can't control, but there are risk factors we have more control over. For example, low body weight. Being of low body weight, especially with low muscle mass, you're at increased risk. So maintain a healthy weight, and exercising to maintain muscle mass, particular weight-bearing activities can be helpful. Think about walking versus swimming. And then, of course, there's a healthy diet. Many nutrients are linked with osteoporosis, some from consuming too much and others too little. Too much vitamin A, sodium, and alcohol can increase your risk, and too little protein, vitamin D, and calcium. Calcium can be associated with increased risk. We're going to take a look at calcium and vitamin D. However, here, looking at the RDAs and what they are compared to our current intake. So here's the RDAs for males and females is 1,000 milligrams per day, and men are doing fine. They're at 1,000 to about 1,100 milligrams per day. It's not wrong to eat above the RDA. Women were low. We're averaging only about 850 milligrams. So we need to increase that a bit more. If we think about our food sources, our two major food sources are going to be dairy and vegetables. Dairy provides 70 to 75% of all the calcium consumed in a day. Our vegetables provide another 5 to 10%, and that does include legumes. If we look at specific foods within these groups, look at this first bar, we can see here's a cup of milk, so that would be one serving of the dairy group, and it provides about 31% of the daily value for calcium. Cheese, same. So all milk is naturally going to be a good source of calcium. If we look at these sources of vegetables, here's soy milk. Now, I want to make a note, this is unfortified soy milk. This would be the amount of calcium there naturally. And it has about 6% of the daily value. 2 cups of spinach, so much less concentrated. It's hard to get enough calcium if you don't have your dairy intake, or you need to take it from fortified sources. So you can take a fortified source of soy milk, and orange juice, any of those types of things are going to be good sources, but dairy is going to be the best. If we look at vitamin D, the RDAs for vitamin D are 15 micrograms for males and females up to the age of 70, and then it increases to 20 micrograms. We actually need more as we get older. And look at our intake. Women, on average, get about 4 micrograms, and men are getting 5 to 6. Now, for you recall, vitamin D is made from, we do consume it, and we also make it from UV light hitting our skin. This is only from the amount that we consume. So we're really depending upon either taking a supplement of vitamin D or getting it from the sun and UV light. If we focus here, though, on our food groups, I want to first focus on the right-hand side here. So just specific foods. I don't want to say that this is a food group. Usually I think about food groups being a good source, but both of this, salmon and eggs, are in the food group, the protein food groups. But the protein food group as a whole are not good sources of vitamin D. So chicken and beef and beans will not be good sources of vitamin D, but salmons and eggs specifically are. So thinking about specific sources. Milk is going to be our most consistent source of vitamin D. Milk is not a great source of vitamin C, except we fortify it. So if we look here at this graph down here below, this is in units of micrograms, so the actual amount that we find. And I want you to pay attention to this first bar here. This is the amount of vitamin D that's found naturally in milk. Very, very poor source. But we will fortify milk with vitamin D, and we fortify all types, whether it's whole milk, low milk, or skim milk. They all have the same amount of vitamin D. And so all forms of milk that are fortified will have about 1/3 of the daily value for vitamin D. So now we come back and think about the risk for osteoporosis and how that links to calcium. And we want to avoid this. We have many different risk factors. It's not just calcium, but calcium and vitamin D are two risk factors that we can control. So having lifetime adequate intake are going to be one of those ways that we can try and reduce our risk for development of osteoporosis.